Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Kennedy family has become some of the most important characters in America's political and pop culture. In today's video, we are going to be talking about a number of recurring accidents and incidents that have occurred to different members of the family since the beginning of the 21st century that has led to many, including members of the family, to believe that there is a curse looming over them that will never let them be happy. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Rosemary Kennedy was the oldest daughter of Rose and Joseph Kennedy, born on September 13, 1918. Rosemary was born on the family house in Massachusetts. However, what should have been an incredibly happy and joyous moment for the family was turned sour after the doctors were not able to arrive on time due to a breakout of the Spanish flu, and Rose was instructed to keep her legs closed by the nurse. She did so for 2 hours, in which Rosemary was in the birth canal without oxygen. This caused Rosemary to have brain damage, and while at the time the family didn't have a medical diagnosis, it was obvious that there was something wrong with their daughter, whom by age 2 had not yet hit basic development stages that a child her age should have, such as crawling, sitting up, and learning to walk. She was also unable to keep up with her siblings while they played outside, which would cause her to have fits, which were later diagnosed as seizures. Despite what most families of their time would have done, the Kennedys decided to raise Rosemary at home instead of institutionalizing her. At age 15, Rosemary was sent to a boarding school in Rhode Island since she was too far behind in her grade level at school. However, her parents made sure to pay the school handsomely by providing them with a new tennis court and a number of donations in order to make sure that Rosemary would have individualized education and would be kept away from other students. In the late 1930s, the Kennedy family moved to the UK after Joseph was named US ambassador in the country. During this time, Rosemary was placed in a Catholic school run by nuns who were training her to become a kindergarten teacher. She enjoyed social outings to the opera, tea dances, dress fittings, and other social interests, visited the White House, spent her summers in the south of France with the rest of the family, and was presented as a debutante in Buckingham Palace to King George and Queen Elizabeth. This would turn out to be the last happy memories that Rosemary would have in her life, since in the beginning of the 40s, the family was forced to move back to the US after World War II broke out. Back home, according to her sister Eunice, Rosemary started to quickly reverse her progress. She became irritable, difficult to be around, and prone to violent outbursts, during which she would injure others. On top of that, she was expelled from a summer camp in Massachusetts, was sent to a boarding school in Philadelphia that she only attended for a week, and was finally placed in a convent school in Washington, of which she very quickly started to sneak out of. All of this worried her parents tremendously, and while I'm sure that they were worried by the state of their daughter, it's true that their main concern at the time was how Rosemary would negatively impact the political careers of her brothers. When Rosemary was 23, doctors advised Joseph Sr. to submit her to a lobotomy. If you don't know what this is, a lobotomy was a form of surgery considered a valid form of psychological treatment that involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. Joseph agreed to this but didn't tell Rose until the procedure was done in November 1941. After Rosemary was sedated by the doctors, they made incisions in both sides of her head through which they inserted 2 spatulas that would be used to sever the link between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. During this process, Rosemary was still awake, and while one doctor cut her open, the other would ask her to do things such as recite the Lord's Prayer, sing God Bless America, or count backwards, and depending on her answer, they would decide if they should stop cutting or not, something that they did after Rosemary became incoherent. Despite what the doctors promised, the operation did not help Rosemary in any way. In fact, it only made her mental capacity diminish to that of a 2-year-old. Rosemary became unable to talk, walk, and became incontinent. Immediately after this, Rosemary received physical therapy for months, which only helped her recover partial movement in one arm. Rosemary was first institutionalized in a private psychiatric hospital in New York for a number of years, but then in 1949 she was moved to a private house that Joseph Sr. built for her on the grounds of the St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children, where she spent the rest of her life. Joseph never saw his daughter again, and Rose didn't visit her until 20 years later, during which Rosemary attacked her. Rosemary's absence was explained away as her being a recluse. However, after JFK won the presidential election, they told the public that she had been deemed medically retarded. Her siblings were not made aware of her whereabouts until 1961, and her lobotomy did not become public knowledge until 1987. After their father's death in 1969, Rosemary was involved in the family's life again and was taken to visit relatives in her childhood home, but continued to live in St. Coletta. Rosemary died of natural causes on January 7, 2005 at age 86 surrounded by her family, and was buried next to her parents in Hollywood Cemetery. Joseph Kennedy Jr., also known as Joe, was the firstborn of the Kennedy family on July 25, 1915. Much like the rest of his brothers, Joe was groomed from a young age by his father to enter the political arena, but he was not said to become just any politician. He was said to become the first Roman Catholic U.S. president. In 1941, Joe joined the Navy, and 2 years later he was sent to Britain. In 1944, he completed 25 combat missions and was eligible to return home. Instead, he volunteered for an Aphrodite mission. This operation involved flying a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and a consolidated PB-4Y-1 Liberator with explosives and purposefully crashing them into German bomb launching platforms. These aircrafts had to be first blown by 2 people who then would have to activate the remote control system that would crash the aircrafts, arm the detonators, and parachute from the aircraft. And so, on August 12, 1944, Joe and his co-pilot, Willie Wilford, were given the mission to fly an aircraft that had 9.1 kilos worth of Torpex explosives and crash it against the fortress of Mimouillec in northern France, which was used to bomb London. However, the mission was not executed as planned, and after the safety pin was removed, the bomb exploded prematurely, killing Willie and Joe. After this, drone operations were paused and the Navy missions were cancelled. The Navy's informal board of review ignored the possibility of the crew making a mistake, and a public recount of the operation was released in 1945. Joe and Willie were awarded the Navy Cross, the Air Medal, and the Purple Heart Medal. Their names were listed on the tablets of the missing at the Cambridge America Cemetery and Memorial, and Joe has a commemorative headstone in Arlington National Cemetery and inside the fortress of Mimouillec. Kathleen Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington, also known as Kathleen Kennedy, was born on February 20, 1920, and was the second-born daughter of the Kennedy family. In the late 1930s, Kathleen, of course, moved to the UK with her family, where she was able to make friends with some of the most important members of British high society. With the beginning of the war, Kathleen and her family moved back to the States, but by 1943, Kathleen wanted to go back to the UK again, which she did by volunteering to work in a center for service set up by the Red Cross, where she started a relationship with William Cavendish. William was the son of Edward Cavendish, 10th Duke of Devonshire, and heir to the dukedom. He and Kathleen originally met when she and her family first moved to the UK, and reconnected when she went back despite her mother's wishes, who was against the relationship mainly because their kids would have to be raised under the Church of England instead of the Roman Catholic Church. Kathleen and William got married on May 6, 1944, with her brother Joseph being the only member of her family present. The two spent less than 5 weeks together before William went to France to fight in the war, and 4 months after their wedding, Kathleen became a widow after William was shot in the head by a sniper. Years later, in 1946, Kathleen started a relationship with Peter, 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, who was at the time divorcing his wife. This relationship was also disapproved of by her mother, and Kathleen was told that she would be disowned if she married him. However, she was determined to move forward with this relationship, so when she found out that her dad was traveling to Paris, she decided to go there in order to get his blessing. On May 13, 1948, Kathleen and William took a flight to the French Riviera for a vacation. An hour after takeoff, their plane lost radio connection, and they found themselves in the middle of a storm where they suffered 20 minutes of turbulence. By the time they got out of it, they realized that the plane was nosediving and minutes away from crashing. The pilot tried to regain control, however, the wings, the engines, and the tail of the aircraft tore loose, which caused the body of the plane to quickly crash, immediately killing Kathleen, William, the pilot, and the navigator. Kathleen was buried on the Cavendish family burial grounds, with only her father attending her funeral. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was the youngest son of JFK and Jackie Kennedy, born on August 7, 1963. Patrick was born through an emergency C-section after Jackie felt labor pains while riding a pony with her other 2 children, 5.5 weeks before she was supposed to give birth. Patrick weighed only 2.11 kilos and became the firstborn baby to the sitting president and first lady since the 19th century. Patrick was born at the Otis Air Force Base Hospital, but after showing signs of IRDS and having to be kept in an incubator, doctors advised that it would be best to transfer him to the Boston Children's Hospital. There, he was given hyperbaric oxygen therapy, in which he was, quote, placed in a hyperbaric chamber filled with 100% oxygen and pressurized to greater than 1 atmosphere. Despite the doctor's efforts, Patrick died at 4:04 a.m. on August 9th. The following day, a funeral was held in the private chapel of Cardinal Richard Cushing, and he was initially buried at the Hollywood Cemetery, but later on, he, his father, and his sister Arabella, who was stillborn 7 years earlier, were transferred to the Arlington National Cemetery. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, also known as JFK or John F. Kennedy, was the second born on May 29, 1917. I'm not going to spend too much time on this case and won't talk about the conspiracies because at this point we know more than enough about all of the sides of this specific case, and I want us to focus more on others that are less known. In November 22nd, 1963, John and Jackie took a trip to Texas. There, the two were in a motorcade through downtown Dallas that had the intent of making them as visible as possible to the public. Because of this, the route they were set to take was heavily promoted in the media, and John and Jackie were placed in a convertible. When the motorcade passed by the Texas School Book Depository, shots were fired. The governor of Texas, John Connally, was shot in his upper right back, while John had a bullet enter his upper back, penetrate his neck, slightly damage a spinal vertebra in the top of his right lung, as well as a shot to the head. John was taken to Parkland Hospital, where he was pronounced dead 30 minutes later. Following this, the police started to immediately look for the shooter, and eventually Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder of JFK and the police officer J.D. Tippit, after his co-workers testified that they had seen him go to the 6th floor of the building before the shooting and didn't see him again until the shooting was over. 4 days later, while the police was scouting him, Oswald was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who himself then was arrested and charged for this, but died of cancer after he successfully appealed his conviction and death sentence. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was quickly sworn in and opened the Warren investigation, which concluded that Oswald acted alone and wasn't a part of any conspiracy. A result that has been fiercely disputed by the public, who have come up with their own conspiracies about what really happened, including John being killed by the CIA, by the mob, or even by B. Johnson himself. The day after the shooting, John's body was taken back to Washington and his coffin was carried by a horse to the Capitol to lie in state so that the public could see it. The funeral was held on November 25th at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and he was ultimately buried at Hartington National Cemetery. Ted Kennedy was the youngest child of the Kennedy family, born on February 22, 1932. On June 19, 1964, Ted got on a plane to Springfield, Massachusetts, to accept the nomination for a full term in the Senate at the State Democratic Convention, alongside Birch Bay, his wife Marbella, Edward Moss, and Edwin Simney. The plane crashed into an apple orchard 3 miles from the runway. Edward and Edwin died, while Ted broke 3 vertebrae, 2 ribs, had a severe back injury, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding, for which he spent months in the hospital and spent the rest of his life having back issues. On July 18, 1964, Ted and his cousin Joseph Gargan went to the Chappaquiddick Island for the weekend, alongside Mary Jo Kopishne, Rosemary Q, Esther Newberg, sisters Nance and Mary Ellen Lyons, Susan Tannenbaum, Paul McComb, John B. Crimmins, Charles Threader, and Raymond LaRosa. According to Ted's recount of the events, Mary asked him to take her back to her hotel at around 11:15 p.m., and he agreed even though he normally didn't drive. In order for her to get back to her hotel, she would have to take a ferry which left at midnight. However, Mary nor Ted informed anyone else that she was leaving, and she left her purse and hotel key in the house. According to Ted, he immediately drove 1/2 mile north on Chappaquiddick Road and mistakenly made a wrong turn onto the dirt dyke road. However, according to part-time Deputy Sheriff Christopher Luke, he saw the car at around 12:40. The car drove slowly past him and stopped. He tried to get close to the car thinking that they were lost, but then the car started to back up towards him and then move forward and speeded away. Once Ted and Mary were on Dyke Road, he drove to Dyke Bridge, and seconds after they got on it, he lost control of the car, which sent the car over the bridge, landing on the roof. Ted was able to swim out of the car, but Mary did not. Ted claimed that he called her name from the shore and even tried to swim down to find her, but couldn't do it, and afterwards he decided to walk back to the house. He walked by 4 houses from which he could have asked for help, but he claimed that none of them had their lights on, and he didn't even try to see if someone was home in any of them. However, a resident of one of the houses claimed that she was home and had the lights on. When Ted arrived back to the house, he took Joseph and Paul from the group before collapsing in the back of a car in which Joseph drove the 3 of them back to the bridge, where he and Paul jumped in to try and find Mary but were unable to do so, after which they drove to the ferry landing where the 3 discussed what they should do next, with Joseph and Paul insisting that they needed to report the accident to the police. However, Ted decided to swim from the ferry landing to Edgartown so that he could go to sleep, and Joseph and Paul drove back but didn't tell anyone about the accident. According to witnesses, the next morning, Ted was acting like nothing had happened. At 8 a.m. of the next day, Joseph and Paul went to Edgartown to see Ted at the same time that a 15-year-old boy saw the car and told the cottage nearest to the accident, who then called the police. The police called a trained scuba diver and equipment capable of towing or winching the car out of the water, and at around 8:45, Mary's body was found, taken out of the backseat of the car and misidentified as Rosemary since her purse was in the car. Meanwhile, Paul, Joseph, and Ted were back at the ferry landing, where Ted was frantically calling lawyers and friends, including Congressman John B. Tooney, to ask what he should do, while still not reporting that he was driving the car. There, he found out that his car had been found, so he and Paul went back to Edgartown to talk to the police, while Joseph went back to the cottage house to inform the others of the accident. When Ted got to the police station, he requested to make some phone calls. When the police chief, James Arena, got there at around 10 a.m., he was surprised to know that Ted knew about the accident, that he admitted to knowing who the victim was, and that he was driving. Ted then gave him his statement, which James wrote, but Ted never signed. Mary's death was ruled a drowning with no foul play by Dr. Donald Mills. Her body was released to her family, and she was buried on Tuesday, July 22nd. Despite this, John Farrar, the captain of the Edgartown Fire Rescue Unit who found Mary's body, believed that she died due to suffocation given the way in which her body was found, and that she died 3 or 4 hours after the accident. Her body was stiff, her hands were clasping the back seat, and her face was turned upwards. Part of the roof and the truck of the car also appeared to be dry, and according to John, if Ted had asked for help immediately after the crash, she would have survived. Ted's court hearing was set for July 25th, where he pled guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident causing bodily injury. However, his lawyers and the prosecution agreed that jail time should be suspended due to his age and reputation, even though he had a history of reckless driving. After the hearing, Ted gave a speech to the media in which he basically denied all the conspiracies, but this speech left a lot of questions unanswered. Due to this, District Attorney Edmund Dinnis asked for a judicial inquest into Mary's death, but Ted's lawyers asked for a temporary injunction against the inquest, which was granted. Mary's family opposed the inquest, saying that it was unnecessary. However, it was moved to Edgartown in 1970 in secret at the request of Ted's lawyers, and a 763-page transcript was released 4 months later. After the witnesses gave their testimonies, it was found probable cause of a crime and a warrant for his arrest should have been issued, but that never happened. Dinnis did not prosecute him for manslaughter, and her family never took legal action against him. The only consequence that Ted really received from this whole case was having to pay her family $90,904 and $50,000 more from his insurance. Robert Francis Kennedy was the 7th child of the Kennedy family, born on November 20th, 1925. On June 4th, the California primaries took place, and Robert decided to give a speech to his followers in the Ambassador Hotel. After his speech was over at around 12:04 a.m., Robert was supposed to leave to meet with a different group of supporters. However, this was quickly scrapped in favor of him staying there and talking to the media. While trying to walk to the press room, Robert was followed by the crowd, which made it difficult for him to walk and for his team to protect him. In the middle of the chaos, as Robert was shaking hands with people, Sharon took the opportunity to fire 8 shots at Robert in point-blank range, with the fatal shot entering behind his right ear. After the shooting, Robert was taken to the Central Receiving Hospital, where he arrived with a heartbeat, after which he was transferred to the Good Samaritan Hospital to undergo surgery. Robert was pronounced dead on June 6th at around 1:30 a.m. His body was taken to New York and was put on display at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where his funeral was held on June 8th and was ultimately buried at Arlington Cemetery near his brother. On the other hand, his assassin, Palestine native Sharon, would go on to say during an interview that he killed Robert due to his pro-Israel statements, including saying that he wanted to send 50 military planes to Israel. He was sentenced for Robert's murder in April 1969 and was sentenced to death in 1972, but the sentence was changed to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In 1975, he was set to be freed on parole in 1984. However, this was changed in 1982 due to death threats that he made while in prison. As of 2023, he has been denied parole 17 times and has claimed not to have any recollection of the shooting, while his lawyers claim that he was framed. Joseph Kennedy II is the 4th child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy. On August 13, 1973, Joseph, his brother David, his girlfriend Pamela Kelly, her sister Kim, and 3 other friends went on a trip together. On the way home, the Jeep, driven by Joseph, swerved at an intersection and flipped over. The accident threw all of the passengers out of the car. After being taken to the hospital, it was discovered that David had broken his vertebrae and Kelly was paralyzed from the chest down. The doctors also informed her that she would not be able to have children and wouldn't live past 40. Luckily, this didn't happen, and not only was Pamela able to have a daughter named Paige, she lived to 65 years old until her passing in 2020. As for Joseph, after the incident, he was cited for reckless driving, charged $100, and a judge temporarily suspended his license. According to a news report, he gave Pamela $668,000 from insurance settlement and an additional $2,004 over the years following the accident, which later turned into $2,500 when in 2005 Pamela gave an interview in which she stated that Joseph had stopped providing for her and treated her like trash. Edward Kennedy Jr. is the son of Ted and Virginia Kennedy, born on September 26, 1961. At age 12 in 1973, Edward was diagnosed with osteosarcoma on his right leg, which was amputated on November 17th of the same year. Years later, his mother also revealed that Edward almost got onto the Air Florida Flight 90, which crashed and killed 74 people. David Kennedy was the 4th child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, born on June 15, 1955. After watching his dad be assassinated on TV in 1968 when he was only 12 and days away from his birthday, David was never the same and spent the rest of his life struggling with drugs and alcohol. On April 25, 1984, David was staying in room 107 of the Brazilian court. A family member called the hotel to see if he had left to take his plane back to Boston. The hotel secretary went to look for him, and after seeing a lack of response and a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging from the door, she decided to use her spare key to enter the room and found him laying on the floor dead between 2 beds. After his passing, the police arrested David Linwood and Peter Andrew for selling cocaine to David. They claimed that they were innocent, pleaded no contest to a single charge of conspiracy to sell cocaine, and were each fined $200 and sentenced to 18 months probation. David's funeral was held on April 28th, and he was buried next to his grandfather, Joseph Kennedy Sr. William Kennedy is the son of Jen Ann Kennedy and Stephen Edward Smith. In March 1991, William met Patricia Bowman at a bar in Palm Beach. According to her account of the events, the two of them went together to a house owned by his family. There, they walked by the beach, where he asked her to go swimming, but she turned him down, after which he tried to drag her by the leg. She ran away, but he caught up to her in the house pool, where he pinned her down and raped her. After this, she called 2 friends who picked her up and took her to her house, where she called a rape crisis center. Hours later, she called the police to report the case and was given a rape kit examination, which showed sperm in her vagina, complaints of severe pain and bruising. On May 12, 1991, William surrendered to the Palm Beach police and was charged with felony count of sexual battery and 1 count of misdemeanor battery. He was released that same day after posting a $10,000 bond. According to a statement given by his cousin Patrick, William compared Patricia to Glenn Close's character in Fatal Attraction. He also told him that they had sex without a condom and that he thought the whole thing was a setup. According to one of Patricia's friends, she was raped twice, once at the beach and once at the pool, with Ted Kennedy watching the second time. However, Patricia said that she was only raped once. The friend also told the investigators that she didn't see any bruises on Patricia, which went against the police count of seeing indications of bruising. During the trial, the judge refused to let the prosecution introduce a date rape expert who would testify on rape trauma because this would delay the trial. They also refused the testimony of 3 women who came forward with sexual assault allegations against him because the pattern of behavior from their cases wasn't similar enough to the new case. At the end of the trial, after only 75 minutes, the jury found William not guilty. In 2004, he once again was accused of assault by a former employee who filed a civil suit against him. William denied the accusations but still stepped down from his position at the company, and later on, a spokesperson for the organization said that he had settled down 2 separate federal sexual harassment claims. Michael Kennedy was one of the children of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, born on February 27, 1958. In 1997, when he was 39, news broke that he was having an affair with his family's former babysitter, who was a minor at the time, and worst of all, that affair allegedly started when she was only 14. He alleged that he only had sex with her after she turned 16, which is the legal age of consent in Massachusetts, and passed 3 polygraph tests conducted by companies employed and directed by the Kennedy family, aka he investigated himself and found himself not guilty. Months later, for New Year's Eve, the Kennedy family took a trip to Aspen where Michael and his cousins played a game of ski and football. While playing, Michael, who was not wearing a helmet or any safety equipment, lost control of his ski and crashed against a tree. He was then taken to the Aspen Valley Hospital where he was pronounced dead about an hour and a half after the accident and was buried 8 days later at the Hollywood Cemetery. JFK Jr. was the son of JFK Sr. and Jackie Kennedy. On July 16, 1999, John, his wife Caroline, and her sister Lauren got on his Piper Saratoga to attend a family wedding in Massachusetts. He checked in with the air traffic control tower at around 8:30 p.m. However, about an hour later, his plane had lost connection with the control tower. We would later learn that the aircraft had crashed. His family contacted the Coast Guard and told them that they had not arrived, and by 4 a.m., the Coast Guard began a search and rescue mission, but they didn't have much hope of finding anyone alive, especially after the aircraft and their baggage was found in the Atlantic Ocean. On July 21st, the bodies were found. John was found strapped to his seat, while the sisters were found near the fuselage of the aircraft. After the autopsies, it was revealed that they all tested negative for drugs and alcohol, and 3 died upon impact, with a further investigation discovering that the reason of the clash was John's inability to maintain control of the aircraft during a descent over water. The bodies were then taken to Duxbury, where they were cremated in the Mayflower Cemetery crematory. The remains were then taken to the USS Briscoe, where a memorial service was held, and their ashes were scattered in the Atlantic Ocean. Patrick Kennedy is the son of Ted and Joan Kennedy, born on July 14, 1967. Much like his cousin David, Patrick suffered with abusing drugs and alcohol, and in 2006 he got treatment for Oxycontin addiction. Later on the year, on May 4th, Patrick crashed his car into a barricade in Capitol Hill. He claimed to be under the influence of prescribed medicine. However, anonymous sources claimed to have seen him drinking earlier in the evening. He was not asked to take a sobriety test and was driven home by a police officer. The next day, he admitted to an addiction to prescription drugs and said that he would intern himself in a rehab center, in which he stayed until June 5th, and on the 12th, he was sentenced to 1-year probation and a fine of $350 for driving under the influence. He was also ordered to take weekly urine tests, 2 meetings with a probation officer a week, Alcohol Anonymous meetings, and a weekly meeting of recovering addicts. Kara Kennedy was the daughter of Ted and Joan Kennedy, born on February 27, 1960. She passed away on September 16, 2011 of a heart attack while working out at age 51 in Washington. Her body was then taken to Massachusetts, and she was buried at the Hollywood Cemetery. Mary Kennedy was the wife of Robert Kennedy Jr. The two got married on April 15, 1994, and he filed for divorce on May 12, 2010. 3 days later, she was arrested for driving under the influence after struggling with alcoholism. 4 days after that, on the 16th, Mary was found dead at her home in New York. Her death was ruled a suicide by hanging, and the autopsy showed antidepressants on her system. Both her family and the Kennedy family held memorials for her, and afterwards, Robert and her family got into a legal battle to determine who should have control over her body. Robert ended up winning the case, and Mary was ultimately buried at St. Francis Xavier Cemetery. Saoirse Kennedy was the daughter of Courtney Kennedy and Paul Michael Hill. On August 1, 2019, while at the Kennedy compound with her grandmother Ethel, she was taken to the Cape Cod Hospital in Hyannis, where she was pronounced dead after an accidental overdose after years of struggling with depression. She was ultimately buried at the St. Francis Xavier Cemetery. Maeve Kennedy was the daughter of David Townsend and Kathleen Kennedy. On April 2, 2020, Maeve and her son Gideon went missing while paddling a canoe in Maryland. According to the police, they were trying to retrieve a kickball that fell off the canoe, and due to the high wind, they were swept further out into the bay and were last seen near Herring Bay. The Coast Guard and Marine units started searching by boat and helicopter, and around 7 p.m. of April 3rd, the overturned canoe was found and Maeve and Gideon were presumed dead. Her body was found on April 6th, and her son's was found 2 days later, with their deaths being ruled an accidental drowning. That was all for today's video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!